Hello guys and welcome back. Every Halloween the name Pumpkinhead gets thrown around like it's just another monster with a pumpkin for a head, but that is not actually true. Pumpkinhead has never actually had a pumpkin on its head. Instead, it was a demon of vengeance who was brought into the world through a dark ritual by someone desperate for revenge. It didn't choose who it kills, it didn't even choose the body it took. Once it was summoned, the demon became physically and emotionally linked to the person who called for it, and shared their pain, anger, and suffering. Even hurting Pumpkinhead came at a terrible cost. So today we'll be exploring the infernal anatomy of Pumpkinhead, separating what the films clearly establish from what they strongly imply about this legendary demon, and what truly made this terrifying creature one of the most unique demons in the horror genre. Let's begin! Where does Pumpkinhead's body actually come from? Pumpkinhead was not simply created from nothing whenever someone sought revenge. Instead, the ritual involved reviving a mummified body buried in the hidden graveyard. The first part of this ritual was searching for the desired corpse in the local graveyard on the distant mountain. Only those who knew the graveyard's existence could find it. Those who were desperate to take revenge and had no other way to do this had to address a local witch, Haggis, who knew the ritual. In particular, in the first film, she showed Ed Harley, the father who wanted to kill his son's killer, the way to the graveyard, where Ed had to dig out the corrupted corpse of the dead man. This suggests that Pumpkinhead's physical form already existed before the ritual was performed. It confirms that Haggis did not create the monster herself, but instead performed the ritual that awakened it. In particular, the ritual uses the blood of both Ed and Billy as part of the summoning, binding the demon to Ed's desire for revenge. Thus, the ritual suggests that the demon already existed before it was awakened. The film never explains exactly whose body is buried in the graveyard. The series never fully explains whether the buried body is always the same physical vessel or how its appearance is determined. From this perspective, the films leave the exact nature of Pumpkinhead's physical body open to interpretation. Although Pumpkinhead's appearance varies somewhat across the series, the films never explain why. The exact nature of Pumpkinhead's body is never fully explained, leaving its physical form open to interpretation throughout the series. Why does Pumpkinhead's face slowly turn human? Lots of people assume that Pumpkinhead was just another demon from hell, summoned by a witch through a dark ritual. However, that assumption was incorrect because it was not created from thin air, but rather an already existing corpse later used for the ritual. Firstly, it is important to note that to summon Pumpkinhead, one needs to use a particular magic that is rather complex, involving multiple steps. The first movie in the series chronicles the creation of the first Pumpkinhead, summoned by Ed Harley after his son Billy is accidentally struck and killed by a dirt bike, prompting Ed to seek revenge against the teenagers responsible. Ed was overwhelmed by guilt and anger at himself and turned to a witch named Haggis, who told him she could not bring Billy back but could help him take revenge. She warned him that he would have to find a twisted corpse in the mountain graveyard and showed him how to do so. Eventually, Ed finds the ghost-like corpse buried in a shallow hole and brings it to the witch, who then proceeds to perform the ritual. It seemed like it was not that difficult to revive the long-dead entity, but multiple additional steps needed to be taken in order to successfully perform the summoning. Secondly, Haggis instructed Ed to bring the body from the mountain graveyard to her altar, where she used the blood of Ed and his son Billy as part of the summoning ritual before performing the incantation. Interestingly, it seems that in order to successfully perform the ritual, one has to use the blood of both the summoner and the victim. However, the blood appears to bind the summoner and the demon together through a supernatural connection. Therefore, the ritual appears to create a powerful connection between Pumpkinhead and the person who summoned him, although the exact nature of that bond is never explained. In particular, it was Ed's grief and desire for revenge that led him to summon the demon, and he ultimately sacrifices himself to end Pumpkinhead's rampage. Moreover, as the story progresses, Pumpkinhead gradually comes to resemble Ed Harley, while Ed himself begins taking on more demonic features, implying a supernatural connection between them. How does the summoner-demon pain bond actually work? One of the most remarkable traits of Pumpkinhead is the connection between the demon and its summoner. After being summoned, the demon and the person who summoned it become tied magically, body and soul. By commanding the demon to enact its terrible revenge, the summoner becomes psychically linked to the creature and witnesses the horror it unleashes. Therefore, the summoner is forced to witness the demon's acts of vengeance through their supernatural connection. Thus, the first film makes it clear that the summoner cannot remain emotionally detached from the demon's actions because of their supernatural bond. Remarkably, the connection is bidirectional, allowing injuries suffered by either the summoner or Pumpkinhead to affect the other. Because of their supernatural bond, injuries suffered by either Pumpkinhead or its summoner are reflected in the other. This reinforces the deeply personal connection between the demon and its summoner throughout the quest for revenge. In other words, the magical bond between the summoner and the summoned demon makes sure that whatever injuries are dealt to the summoner will be dealt to Pumpkinhead. The first movie provides a rather terrifying example of such a bond and its impact on the summoner. After Ed Harley is accidentally stabbed in the arm with a pitchfork, Pumpkinhead immediately reacts in pain and releases Bunt, revealing the supernatural bond between them. Therefore, the example showcases how the bond between the demon and the summoner makes the former suffer terribly alongside the latter. Remarkably, the bond is instantaneous, meaning that whatever happens to the summoner or Pumpkinhead is immediately felt by the other. Ultimately, the bond serves to explain why the conclusion of the first film was so devastating. It becomes painfully clear to the viewers that Pumpkinhead is almost invincible, as Ed eventually realizes that the only way to stop Pumpkinhead was to sacrifice himself and break the bond. Thus, when Ed Harley ultimately decides to sacrifice himself to end Pumpkinhead's reign of terror, his eventual death breaks the supernatural bond and destroys the demon. Ultimately, the dreadful power of the concluding scene comes from the bond between the summoner and the summoned and how it ultimately affects the relationship between the two. What can Pumpkinhead's body actually survive? One of Pumpkinhead's primary strengths is that it is hard to kill. Its body is significantly reinforced and can withstand incredible pressure. A variety of conventional weapons designed to cause damage to living organisms have very limited effect on the demon. Even if Pumpkinhead gets injured by a weapon, this injury will not affect its ability to pursue the target. The described ability significantly increases the danger level of the entity, as it can be killed only by a specific means. The demon's durability is directly linked to its second primary strength, which is supernatural power. Throughout the films, Pumpkinhead repeatedly demonstrates immense supernatural strength. In the first film, Pumpkinhead sabotages the survivors' attempts to escape by disabling Chris's dirt bike, demonstrating both its strength and its strategic thinking. In the first film, the demon throws both Chris and his dirt bike into a tree with ease. This strength is another example of the demon being incredibly dangerous. Although Pumpkinhead is an incredibly fearsome creature, it is not as intelligent as one might think. The entity is not particularly clever, but it is surprisingly strategic in pursuing its targets. For example, it disabled the only vehicle that could help the main characters escape, and used various obstacles to block the protagonist's path. Also, the demon often uses surprise and carefully timed ambushes to catch its victims off guard. Thus, Pumpkinhead uses its knowledge of the enemy's behavior and tricks to increase the chances of causing harm. The entity's sole recognized weakness is its supernatural bond with its summoner. Despite seemingly being able to withstand most forms of damage, Pumpkinhead's body is indestructible. The only way to permanently destroy the demon is to kill the person who summoned it. In other words, the entity has no conventional permanent physical weakness, as its true vulnerability is its supernatural bond with the summoner. Its existence and power rely solely on the magic spell that brought it to life. What are Pumpkinhead's actual weapons? Pumpkinhead's primary means of attacking its victims is with its long, sturdy claws. With these, Pumpkinhead can disembowel, break, and crush his victims, as well as break things that one might not think a living creature could break. Many supernatural horror film monsters have some sort of weapon they use to attack their victim. However, Pumpkinhead has nothing but his claws. Said claws are one of the more deadly parts of his anatomy as well. The second feature of Pumpkinhead that distinguishes him from other horror monsters is his tail. At the end of its tail is a barbed tip that contributes to the creature's threatening appearance and is occasionally used offensively. This makes Pumpkinhead one of the few supernatural horror monsters with multiple natural methods of attack. Most slashers rely on a single signature weapon, while Pumpkinhead has multiple natural weapons built into his body. Although Pumpkinhead is usually quite violent towards his victims, he is sometimes quite clever in how he attacks them as well. For instance, Pumpkinhead will sometimes use the environment around him to his advantage, either by destroying certain objects or vehicles to slow the victim down or to stop someone else from following him. Pumpkinhead is more clever than most other supernatural horror film monsters that aren't intelligent by nature. Because of the weapons Pumpkinhead naturally has, he rarely uses other objects to hurt people. The barbed tail can be used as an additional weapon in some encounters, complementing Pumpkinhead's claws and immense strength. On top of that, Pumpkinhead has inhuman strength that allows him to crush most of his victims with one strike. Compared to other horror icons and supernatural monsters, Pumpkinhead doesn't have to bring a weapon with him when he goes after people. It is rare for Pumpkinhead to use an outside object to hurt his victims with. In the first film in the series, Pumpkinhead only kills a small number of victims using objects, including impaling Joel with a fallen rifle. One of the later films also shows Pumpkinhead using a stolen knife, although it still relies primarily on its natural weapons. In most of its appearances, Pumpkinhead kills using its claws, strength, and other natural weapons. Does Pumpkinhead have any powers beyond physical combat? Although Pumpkinhead is certainly scary because of its power and toughness, the demon has other qualities that make the idea of facing him terrifying. One of the most frightening traits of this villain is his supernatural ability to track his targets. After Pumpkinhead is summoned, it relentlessly pursues those marked for vengeance. The demon appears to possess a supernatural ability to locate those it has been summoned to hunt. Although the films never explain how Pumpkinhead tracks its victims, it consistently manages to pursue those marked for vengeance. In addition, Pumpkinhead has some control or connection to the weather. Storms erupt wherever he goes, making the demon even more terrifying. The films never explain whether this recurring storm imagery is supernatural or simply part of the story's visual atmosphere. Either way, the recurring storm imagery makes the demon's appearances even more ominous. Despite Pumpkinhead's power, the connection to the weather makes the demon even more frightening since his appearance is always associated with dark and stormy weather. Finally, despite its demonic nature, the original film does not establish Pumpkinhead as being vulnerable to holy symbols. In the first movie, the demon encounters a wooden cross in the abandoned church and destroys it, showing that the symbol does not repel or injure it. The church sequence instead suggests that conventional religious symbols do not offer reliable protection against Pumpkinhead. Unlike many supernatural creatures in horror fiction, Pumpkinhead is not shown to be stopped by crosses or other holy symbols. Altogether, these traits make Pumpkinhead a significantly more fearsome monster than your typical vampire or werewolf. After all, the demon's apparent supernatural tracking ability makes escaping it extremely difficult. In addition, Pumpkinhead is frequently associated with dark, stormy weather throughout the films. Overall, these traits combine to make Pumpkinhead a horrifying experience. In many ways, the demon is much more terrifying than an average vampire or werewolf. After all, there is nothing more frightening than an unstoppable force of vengeance that cannot easily be stopped by conventional means. How did Stan Winston's team actually build this creature? Creating Pumpkinhead was a difficult challenge because the creature had to be intimidating without becoming a laughable caricature of its own name. Stan Winston and his effects team designed Pumpkinhead to avoid a literal pumpkin-headed appearance, instead creating an unnatural skeletal creature with a horrifying look. He was thinking realistically to make the creature frightening rather than an exaggerated Halloween costume of sorts, because of the title itself, Pumpkinhead. Even though Stan Winston directed the film in 1988, the creation of the creature effect was done by his very talented team. Alec Guinness, Shane Mahan, John Rosengrant, and Tom Woodruff Jr. were the ones who constructed and sculpted the creature to be what it is today, Winston. One can only imagine how much work went into this project, as well as the effort to wear the suit to actually act as the famous Pumpkinhead. Not only did Tom Woodruff Jr. star in the movie, but he was also a part of the designing process of the creature effect, Winston. The practical effects used to create Pumpkinhead were remarkable for a film of that scale in the late 1980s. Although performing in the Pumpkinhead suit was physically demanding, Stan Winston's team combined an elaborate creature suit with detailed practical effects to make the monster appear as lifelike as possible. They needed to create a creature that would have a realistic effect in the film, so they chose to go ahead and create a more natural effect for the monster to truly appear as a real creature and not a man in costume. Today, Pumpkinhead is still as frightening as it was 30 years ago, because it wasn't made to appear as a silly monster. It was made to look realistic. It isn't simply a head on a pumpkin, nor is it a comical creature that unfortunately happens to be named Pumpkinhead. It feels like a creature that could realistically inhabit our world. Stan Winston didn't allow himself to fall into the easy trap of creating a Pumpkinhead, but rather thought outside the box for the creation of the film. He envisioned not only a creature that could scare audiences, but one that felt believable. That was the easy route he didn't take. Why was Pumpkinhead almost called something completely different? Before it was branded under the famous name Pumpkinhead, the movie had a completely different working title, Vengeance the Demon. The original working title suggests that the story is more focused on the vengeful demonic nature of the creature rather than its unusual appearance. Yet upon its official branding as Pumpkinhead, the new title shifted the focus towards the creature itself, turning Pumpkinhead into the identity of the monster rather than simply describing it as a demon of vengeance. In fact, the name Pumpkinhead predates its on-screen debut as the monster that would later appear in the film. In fact, the name Pumpkinhead predates its on-screen debut. The film was inspired by a poem written by Ed Justin. Producer Bill Blake became interested in Ed Justin's poem, which ultimately inspired the development of the film. The poem eventually served as the foundation for the screenplay that became Pumpkinhead. In fact, this might be the most interesting part of the legend about Pumpkinhead. Unlike other horror icons such as Freddy Krueger, purposely designed to become a horror franchise staple, or Dracula, whose legendary status was already secured before he appeared on screen in Bela Lugosi's 1931 vampire film, Pumpkinhead was not intended to gain such fame. What began as Ed Justin's poem eventually evolved into a horror film franchise. The film ultimately expanded upon Ed Justin's original poem by developing the legend of the vengeful demon known as Pumpkinhead. How does Pumpkinhead's body change across the sequels? Although Pumpkinhead is a single legendary monster, his appearance seems to change entirely in different movies. However, the most evident difference is seen in the second chapter, Pumpkinhead 2: Blood Wings, as the monster depicted there is almost entirely different from the first one. In fact, it is not even called Pumpkinhead anymore, but the deformed orphan Tommy Parnell, a deformed orphan who was murdered years earlier by a gang of local youths before later being resurrected through the Pumpkinhead ritual. Through a ritual performed by his caretaker, Miss Ossie, who made him look clumsy and grotesque in comparison to the prototype. More evidently, his bloodshot and pupilless eyes and a set of jagged teeth stick out, making Tommy look even more terrifying. Unlike the original film's version of Pumpkinhead, Tommy is ultimately defeated by sustained gunfire, reflecting the sequel's somewhat different interpretation of the creature. Moreover, the latter seems to be more traditional in comparison to the prototype, as his head is smaller, the teeth are more yellow, and the skin is more wet and rotten, making the monster look more evil, while the bumps that used to represent plant cells are replaced by a more demonic and pumpkin-like head. Apart from that, his body is no longer boxy, but more muscular to give the monster a more powerful look. Nevertheless, Pumpkinhead's appearance and proportions vary noticeably between different films. Did Pumpkinhead ever have a son? One of the most surprising things about the Pumpkinhead mythology is that its monsters can and do have offspring. Pumpkinhead 2: Blood Wings introduced the audience to one such creation, a Pumpkinhead by the name of Thomas Tommy Parnell, who is presented in Pumpkinhead 2 as the offspring of Pumpkinhead. Tommy was apparently born to an unnamed woman several years before the events of the movie. The change in the design was most likely made for the better, since Tommy is much more understandable as a character than his predecessors. Unlike other Pumpkinheads, he was not purely driven by the lust to kill, and he actually had feelings in addition to the monstrous instincts. Tommy's humanity made him relatable. In fact, he is the sole Pumpkinhead in any of the movies who had mercy on the doomed and who had motivations other than obedience to his master or programming. Tommy is portrayed as retaining traces of his humanity, occasionally showing mercy that other versions of Pumpkinhead do not, allowing him to spare certain people despite his monstrous nature. He is one of the few versions of Pumpkinhead portrayed with lingering humanity and personal motivations beyond simple vengeance. Because later films do not revisit this storyline, Tommy's place within the broader franchise continuity remains uncertain, which may explain why he seemingly did not appear in any of the later movies. Tommy is better seen as a one-off aberration rather than an official part of the canon. After all, for the fans of the original 1988 classic, the very notion of Pumpkinhead having descendants in the first place was already an incredibly surprising idea. Has Pumpkinhead ever fought other horror icons? Although Pumpkinhead is mostly famous for the movie series, the character has also appeared in other forms of media over the years. Unlike other horror icons such as Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, or Michael Myers, Pumpkinhead never became a franchised killer with multiple crossovers. However, comic books and video game industries managed to provide Pumpkinhead with a new content beyond the movie plot and narrative. First of all, Pumpkinhead was featured in a Dark Horse comics series named Pumpkinhead: The Rites of Exorcism, published in 1993. It was planned to release 4 issues of the series, however, it was cancelled after 2. Although the story was never completed, it expanded Pumpkinhead's mythology beyond the original film. The unreleased 3rd issue cover hinted that the story might have explored more of Pumpkinhead's past, but the series was cancelled before that storyline could be published. Therefore, it is possible to assume that the comic book publisher recognized Pumpkinhead's potential to become a franchised horror icon. Moreover, it seems that Pumpkinhead had such popularity that he could exist even on the pages of comic books. First of all, in 2018, there was a 5-issue limited series of comic books published by Dynamite Entertainment. The project was also written by Cullen Bunn, and it seems that he managed to create an entirely new story for the undead killer. In other words, Pumpkinhead takes a more central role in the story, while still serving as its vengeful supernatural killer, based on which the whole narrative is being built. These appearances demonstrate that Pumpkinhead's mythology has expanded beyond the original films into comics and games. Another appearance came in the unofficial fan-made horror fighting game called Terrordrome: Rise of the Boogeyman. The fan-made game Terrordrome features Pumpkinhead alongside several famous horror characters in a non-canonical crossover. First of all, he is one of the central figures along with Ash Williams, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger. Moreover, Pumpkinhead is one of the playable characters featured in the game's narrative content. Hence, it can be assumed that concepts such as Terrordrome and Pumpkinhead can exist only within the horror genre and its iconic figures. Therefore, it can be concluded that Pumpkinhead managed to gain popularity beyond the movie industry. It can be seen from the examples of comic book series that were created around the horror icon. Moreover, even the video game industry chose Pumpkinhead for the Terrordrome game. However, his popularity still seems to be lower than the other horror franchised icons, such as Jason, Freddy, or Michael Myers. What actually kills a demon that can't be killed? Although being one of the hardest creatures to kill, Pumpkinhead still has one significant weakness that makes it vulnerable. Compared to other types of monsters or demons that can be weak against a specific spell or item, Pumpkinhead is vulnerable to one specific circumstance. Throughout the series and the movie, the weakness of Pumpkinhead becomes apparent as the main character tries to find a way to kill the big demon. In fact, all the attempts to kill it fail because Pumpkinhead is not vulnerable to any type of attack or weapon. However, the big demon has one significant weakness, according to the movie released in 1988. The original film establishes that Pumpkinhead can only be permanently killed if its summoner dies, which makes it almost impossible to kill the creature in a one-on-one fight. The weakness of Pumpkinhead is showcased through Ed Harley, who realizes that because of his supernatural bond with the demon, his own death is the only way to destroy it. Throughout the movie, he comes to the realization that the only way to stop the demon is to sacrifice himself. After first shooting himself and realizing it is not enough, Ed asks Tracy to finish him, knowing that his death will destroy Pumpkinhead. After Tracy shoots Ed at his request, Pumpkinhead collapses at the same time because the bond between them is broken. The creature's body then catches fire, which finally ends up destroying it. Unlike many supernatural creatures, Pumpkinhead does not have a true physical weakness that can be exploited. His only true weakness is the magical bond that connects him to his summoner. According to the series and the movie, the one who is to blame for creating Pumpkinhead should be the one to sacrifice himself or herself. Thus, it can be said that the weakness of the big demon makes it an even more terrifying horror villain. In conclusion, one major weakness associated with Pumpkinhead makes it a horror-inflicting demon that is almost impossible to kill. Although the big demon's weakness depends on the death of its summoner, it is still extremely difficult to defeat because its body has no true physical vulnerability. Thus, defeating Pumpkinhead comes at a terrible personal cost, because the summoner must ultimately sacrifice themselves. The true horror of Pumpkinhead is that the person who creates the monster is also the only person capable of destroying it. So, to sum it all up, Pumpkinhead is a reflection of humanity's anger, grief, and the thirst for revenge because, in all of its iterations, the monster follows the same principle that none can easily avoid, escape, or kill without paying a befitting price. Stan Winston's team managed to create a being that is frightening not because of its imposing size and claws, but because it is connected to the summoner on a deeply personal level. Decades later, Pumpkinhead remains one of the horror genre's most unique creatures. So, whose infernal, monstrous, or divine anatomy should we explore next? Do let us know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.